Welcome to another episode of the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. This is episode number 27, and we're going to be focusing on a very serious anthropological issue that relates to culture across the world today. But we're going to be focusing on a specific region, and I'm going to make a series. We're going to be talking about gender inequality and how culture has actually played a role in that across the world, and how progress is being made thanks to um, this new generation in this new period where people are becoming more comfortable with certain things. And in this episode, we're going to be talking the Middle East. Um, we're going to be talking about North America, South America, Europe, Asia. We're going to have an important series on this because it's a very important topic. Gender inequality is one of the most important cultural issues in our in the world today. Um, for many years, females have not had the same rights, the same access to things as males. And although, in some countries it's much better than in others, and dramatic progress has been made recently, but there's still definitely a way to go, especially in certain parts of the world, like the Middle East. And my goal is to really try and educate you and open your eyes because in the United States, it's not, there's definitely a need for more gender equality, and there's definitely a way to go. But it's nothing compared to other parts of the world. And sometimes we overlook these issues because of our own, where we are. And that's understandable, but then it's important to educate yourself and understand what really is going on outside the world. And just a bit about the podcast. So, this is episode 27. I started off really focusing on German culture, German history. I then tried to broaden out. I focused on a few German political things and modern stuff that's happening right now. A bit about language learning too. And now my goal is to really try and stretch out and discuss many important anthropological topics or issues. Some of them are more positive. We did a video or episode on eating utensils and culture, attire, but some are more serious, like this one, and this is very important. I upload my podcast on YouTube. It's on the Thoughts with Lakshman channel, and it's available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I also have a series on YouTube, the Learning German with Lakshman series, um, and I have over 30 episodes of that. So if you're interested in learning German as a foreign language, we start out really basic with vocabulary, but then we get more advanced and we talk about important grammar structures, and we're continuing that. I upload pretty consistently. So take a listen if you want to, but without further ado, let's get into it. So, although there isn't really, uh, s- you know, gender equality in the Middle East, including Israel, the phenomena of sexism and misogyny are global, and it's not particular to Islam or the Middle East. The status of women widely varies in the Middle East. Um, and it's important that the norms in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most oppressive states in the region, aren't used to generalize with the entire region. Many of the causes for the inferior status of Middle Eastern women are indigenous, but the West, especially the U.S., has really tried to exacerbate this, oppression. And when you discuss, general issues facing women in the Middle East, the diversity of female lifestyles and conditions is often lost. Accustomed to stereotypical depictions, Westerners are told that Middle Eastern women are passive, weak, and always filed, and it's often assumed that the severe conditions in Saudi Arabia, where women are not even allowed to drive cars, represent the norm for women throughout the Middle East and in the larger Muslim world. In reality, this is not really the case. Saudi Arabia's versions of both Islam and sexism are rather unique in their severities. Although the Taliban in Afghanistan is now emulating the sexist Saudi model. Women enjoy political and social rights in many Muslim countries, and Egypt has actually recently granted women the right to divorce their husbands. In Tunisia, abortion is legal and polygamy is prohibited. Women have served as ministers in the Syrian, Jordan, um, Egyptian, Iraqi, and Tunisian governments, and as vice president in Iran before the U.S. actually. But, Kamala Harris. But yet the problems of Middle Eastern women remain acute. Islamic, Christian, and Jewish jurists and theologians, all the males, they've really provided Middle Eastern society with the most exclusivist and conservative interpretations of religious laws, which have truly burdened women, in the family, the society, and the state. The top position in government, according to strict Islamic laws, is denied to women based on a dubious hadith, which is a collection of sayings and deeds attributed to Muhammad. According to the Inter Palia, the political representation of women in parliaments in Arab nations lags behind all other countries of the world. And Kuwait has yet to grant women, the right to vote. Yet Muslims in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Turkey have all been led by women. In Israel, a woman once headed the government. Her name was Golda Meir. Although the political elite has almost been exclusively of males since the creation of the state. Islamic clerics continue to enjoy a tremendous amount of power and often exercise great influence in the field of education. The Middle East, including Israel, is unduly hostage to clerics who do not really allow the codification of civil personal status laws. For example, only Cyprus, of all the Middle Eastern countries, recognizes interfaith marriages. Furthermore, um, Islam has sanctioned and perpetuated many sexist practices and views, um, including polygamy and the stigmatization of other stuff and the requirement of widely obedience, uh, wifely obedience to the husband and the inequality of inheritance and court appearances. And all of these practices have at one point or another, been part of Christian and Jewish practices or cultures. And although, religion bears major responsibility for the inferior status of women, it cannot solely be blamed for the gender problem in the Middle East. In reality, the role of culture has actually even been more prominent in perpetuating the oppression of women. You know, um, honor crimes, for example, have no basis in Islam. Furthermore, filing has become a symbol of Middle Eastern oppression of women. The practice actually came from Christians. Um, the role of the West regarding Middle Eastern women is often obscured. Western colonial powers have been hypocritical at best. Layla Ahmed, who published a study of women and gender in the Islamic world, dubs the Western attitude as colonial feminism. And she says that according, uh, you know, colonial feminism refers to the tendency among colonial officers to champion Muslim and women's rights, while at the same time opposing women's rights in their own countries. Thus the status of women in the Middle East was used merely to, uh, degenerate Islam and the culture of the region. And the legacy of colonial feminism persists. Feminism in the Middle East is often discredited, by governments and by local enemies of feminism because it is associated with the sequels of colonialism. Um, in the present day Middle East, the Western powers' responsibility for the current state of affairs cannot be denied. Ever since the 1950s, successive American governments have supported Saudi Arabian Islam and have funded and armed uh, Middle Eastern women and frustrated their efforts at emancipation. Furthermore, since many of the oppressive governments in the Middle East, um, are survived really only because of Western military and economic support, the responsibility for local oppression has external dimensions. Um, and there are certain problems with the current with U.S. policy over the years, because the U.S. continues to support a uh, very conservative uh, version of Islam through its support of the Saudi Arabian government. And the U.S. financial aid supports the oppressive regimes in the regions rather than the civil and feminist organizations. And American policy during the Cold War actually promoted conservative Islamic fundamentalism, which now terrorizes the region and its women. The U.S. government, who hailed, the Iranian Shah's regime a few months before its overthrow as for years, exploited human rights rhetoric by highlighting its enemies' human rights violations and ignoring its friends' violations. The people of the Middle East have not forgotten, that Washington ignored the Shah of Iran's abysmal record of human rights violations while strictly scrutinizing, the human rights records of Libya and Syria, for example. Of course, Libya and Syria do violate human rights, but Washington's double standard is cruel to some other Middle Eastern countries. Also, the U.S. economic and political interest in the Middle East stems largely from, the inability or unwillingness of the U.S. to judge human rights on a universal and neutral basis. Not that the U.S. should view itself or that it should be viewed by others as the ultimate arbiter of the human rights situation around the world, but many human rights organizations have documented human rights violations within the United States. Yet the U.S. presents itself to the Middle East and other regions of the world as the authority on and the judge of human rights standards and does not admit that its actions, both within and outside the U.S., often worsen situations. In the Middle East, for example, Saudi Arabia stands as a clear example of American hypocrisy. No serious and credible policy on human rights can ignore, the abysmal record of the Saudi royal family, which has imposed, on the Saudi Arabian people one of the most oppressive regimes in the world. Saudi Arabia's government is based on institutional sexism and intolerant religious exclusiveness. And the brand of Islam imposed in Saudi Arabia is seen in no other country. American support for the Saudi royal family has permitted that government to violate human rights and to ignore the pleas of Saudi men and women for reforms. Crown Prince Abdullah, who has assumed more powers in the past 2 years in the wake of the near um, incapacitation of King Fahd, has publicly alluded to popular demands for social, political, and legal reforms affecting Saudi women. Yet, Washington, which routinely interferes in the minute affairs in the region and in the internal domestic situation of many Arab countries, has not made one public statement in support of the Saudi woman in the face of state oppression and discrimination. How can the U.S. government make speeches and statements in support of 13 Iranian Jews who are accused of treason and yet remain silent about the plight of millions of Arab women who are oppressed daily by a pro American government? How can the U.S. scrutinize the human rights record of Libya and Iran, but not of Saudi Arabia? Iran's political system, with all its shortcomings, is certainly superior to the, political system in Saudi Arabia. But U.S. support for Saudi Arabia has also harmed the cause of reforming Islam because Saudi oil wealth helps to promote a very conservative branch of Islamic theology and jurisprudence throughout the Muslim world. The Saudi Arabian branch of Wahhabiyya Islam targets women, and they are denied political roles. They are deprived of driving privileges. They're confined to educational institutions inferior to those reserved for men, and they're still subject to the legal practice of guardianship, which treats women as legal inferiors who cannot move or travel without the legal permission of their fathers, brothers, husbands, or a remote male relative in some cases. While Saudi Arabia welcomes technology allowing it to accommodate U.S. military needs and requirements and fights political reforms under the slogan of maintaining its cultural and Islamic authenticity. The campaign against gender equality and religious reform, spearheaded by the Saudi royal family, is directly or indirectly sponsored by the U.S., the main political benefactor of the Wahhabi government. And though the Saudi case is exceptional, it is illustrative of the determinants and consequences of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Unfortunately, U.S. aid programs don't help Middle Eastern women either. Although the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have belatedly accommodated themselves to the needs of civic organizations around the world, the U.S. foreign aid program is not based on need and is severely tarnished by its political agenda. The Canadian foreign aid program is geared toward the empowerment of both the poor and women, and it grants aid on the basis of need. But the largest recipient of U.S. aid remains Israel, which has a per capita income comparable to that of the UK. Moreover, the U.S. government still favors rewarding and punishing governments through its aid programs, instead of supporting the courageous feminist and human rights non-government organizations in the Middle East. The U.S. aid program helps finance the defense industry in America instead of doing that. And this type of aid only serves to promote a culture of corruption in the recipient countries and keeps unelected officials in power. In recent years, Washington is giving more money, to civic associations, but the amounts are, minuscule when compared to U.S. military aid or in the needs of Middle Eastern NGOs. Many private philanthropic organizations in the West have shifted their large, aid civil associations to the Middle East and now try and help these feminist organizations to navigate between the hostility of the state and the hostility of Islam fundamentalists in society. These organizations um, and and female groups, blood groups, by the way, too, are promoting economic development amongst women, and that would benefit. Uh, they would benefit from the U.S. economic aid. Yet even when groups like the feminist organization led by Nawal Sadal in Egypt, when they receive private American aid, their rank and file members object. And wary of American motives in foreign policy, such groups often detest and suspect American funding. So I think it's pretty clear that one, the U.S. needs to take a stronger stance here. Um, Not just the U.S., other countries in the world need to. I know this article focuses on the U.S., but I think other countries need to also step in. There's definitely a double standard relative to human rights violations, and not enough is really being done considering how severe some of these violations are. Washington must end its traditional disregard for the plight of Middle Eastern women, incorporate the interests and welfare of women into foreign aid programs. And, because of the past, Washington's rhetoric on human rights is not taken seriously by the people in the Middle East, and probably rightly so. Although the U.S. Government scrutinizes the human rights records of governments it dislikes, it ignores similar abuses in friendly countries, um, and like Saudi Arabia, that has the worst record on women's rights in the world. And Saudi Arabia now exemplifies the essential flaws and errors of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and it makes it complicated for the U.S. in that position. Um, Obviously, this article takes a really strong stance, but I agree with some to the level that they're saying because there is definitely a need for more progress. There's definitely a need for more intervention. Given how serious the situation is, it's similar to the Uyghur situation in China. We talk about it, people know about it, but not enough is being done. It's like a crisis that's happening right now. There's a crisis for many of these women in the Middle East, and there's also a crisis for the Uyghurs in South and China. And I think Without a doubt, more should be done, not just by the US, but other countries, even though this article does strongly focus on the US. But, thank you for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed. I hope um, you do some research about this topic because it's very important. I hope that you try and help out because this is very, very important. And get involved. Try your best. But thank you and goodbye.